Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. So, this is a sort of epilogue to the Russian Ground Forces series. If you haven't watched it yet, this video will probably seem a bit disjointed and not make much sense, so give the other videos a watch first. Also, if you're just here to watch the kill compilation, skip ahead to this time. I really hope you enjoy it. For everyone else though, this video is intended to cover the new additions to the tree since the last series has been running. We'll go over BR changes, final lineups, and a couple of fixes and changes to existing vehicles. There has been lots of minor stuff changed as well, but we'll just be covering aspects that tangibly affect gameplay. If I've forgotten anything, which I probably will have, I'll add it to the description. Anyway, thanks for being here, let's get into it. So, during the series, Russia did get a handful of new vehicles we should briefly cover. So, first off, in the tech tree, we got two new additions in Tier 1, and we'll be starting with the BT-7M. Identical in all respects to the regular BT-7 apart from the engine, which has an extra 100 horsepower. This doesn't allow the M to reach a higher top speed, but it does allow it to accelerate and maneuver much faster, and that's about it. Personally, I don't think this change technically deserves 2 BR jumps from 1.3 to 2.0, but it is an objectively better vehicle, and to be honest, having it at a lower BR wouldn't have too much impact on the enemies it could fight anyway. There isn't a 1.7 lineup, so it would mostly have to be played at 2.0 regardless, so not a big problem. In any case, at 2.0, you can now make a stronger lineup with this thing, the Su-76M, T-70 and T-28. It's a shame it's only a Tier 1 as it doesn't have access to the scouting function Tier 2s have, but still. It's a nice addition to the lower tiers and I'm glad it's been added in. Next up, we have the T-28 1938 model, which is identical in armor and mobility to the regular version, but the 1938 uses a weaker cannon, the same 75mm howitzer the T-26-4 uses, and because of this, it sits at 1.3. At this BR, the T-28's armor and mobility will be fairly strong, but the cannon of course will hold it back as there are just some tanks this thing can't reasonably deal with frontally at all, or even actually from the side. The armor won't really be OP either as it isn't going to be fighting weaker enemies compared to the 2.0 T-28 as they can both see 1.0 tanks. But it does have the element of artificial survivability with the MG turrets and high crew count, so it does have a place. Playstyle with this one is essentially the same as the regular T-28, although you will have to play at the closer ranges extensively to guarantee the gun will work. Your armor won't save you at distance either, so if you're spotted outside of the effective range of your gun, there's nothing you can really do. So close range is where this thing works best. It's worth playing for a little bit in the lower tiers, but has very little longevity. It isn't quite worth using for long, as it's quite objectively outclassed by the later T-28s. If you like low tier games though, you can use this thing at 1.3 decently enough. I think this tank and the new BT are only really here because of Enlisted, which you should totally check out by the way. Mike and I stream it on Friday after War Thunder, so I think that's why these two tanks have come together. But yeah, in short, keep to the playstyle of the regular T-28 and stick to the closer ranges if you'd like to give this one a go. But it's not really worth using for too long. Next up, we got the limited BT-7TD. This vehicle is entirely identical to the BT-7 in the main tree and just comes with a special winter camo. The same design that's found on the premium T-26 and T-34. This was a Twitch drop event tank for one of the series of drops for Enlisted. You could also get the same tank in that game too, so it was a neat little crossover. Ultimately though, if you don't have it, you aren't really missing out on anything. It's entirely identical apart from the camo, so just a little hanger collectible really. Next up, we have the T-10A, an early version of the T-10M that isn't quite as powerful. This was the main prize for the first season of the Battle Pass and is available as a coupon on the marketplace as well. It's a Tier 5 premium, which is pretty useful, but its performance isn't entirely consistent. At 7.7, it's a bit of an alternative to the IS-4M. It shares an identical cannon, the 122 D25T, with the same rounds as well. It also has a faster reload at 19.5 seconds stock, compared to the IS-4's 27.1 seconds. The turret traverse is also slightly faster too, and it comes with a short stabilizer, so the gun will stay perfectly level below 25 kph, which is pretty nice. Mobility as well is decent. Not quite as fast as the T-10Ms, it does have a slightly weaker engine, but compared to the IS-4, it's a lot more responsive and quicker to accelerate. Although its reverse speed is slower when compared to the IS-4. The reverse speed and acceleration did let the IS-4 swing the hull around fairly quickly, which was actually quite a big advantage. The T-10 can't really do this, which is a bit of a shame. Armor-wise, it's good, but only really at its own BR. It shares a functionally identical hull to the T10, but the turret is different and not quite as strong. 105 Sabo can get through the turret face next to the mantlet, and 105 Heat can get through essentially the entire turret face. It can get through the mantlet block too, but this isn't entirely reliable. The mantlet holds around 370 to 410mm of protection in various spots, so this section is still decently strong. Armor overall isn't quite as reliable as the IS-4M, but it can play to different strengths. The faster reload, short stab, and more responsive mobility means it can play a bit more aggressively, although these advantages do fizzle off in up tiers against darts. But still, in the right spot, it can still do some decent work, and with a bit of luck, the armor will occasionally save you. Currently, this thing is on sale at the time of writing for only 25 Gaijin coin, around half that of a tier 5 premium on the store. So it is fairly cheap for what it is, but this price does reflect its usability a bit, and also because the market is currently saturated right now. In some situations and maps it can do really well, but in others it does have very little usability. It's still limited by the gun depression as well as the BR it's fighting at, so you can't take it out and guarantee you'll get a map where it'll work, and a BR where the armor will be effective. I do quite like heavy tanks, so I've enjoyed my time playing it, but it isn't going to be a vehicle for everyone. Although it is cheap and likely will remain cheap for a fair while, so as long as it sits below the price for regular tier 5 premium, you would be saving a bit of money in getting it compared to one of the other options if you just look at the tank as a product, but again, it just isn't a vehicle for everyone. So I wouldn't recommend you snap it up if it doesn't quite seem like your thing. Next up, something I can only really cover vaguely as it hasn't actually been released yet, but for the April Fool's crafting event we will be getting the SU-76D as one of the earlier rewards. Effectively, from what I understand, it's the SU-57B, but with a 75mm cannon instead. I imagine this thing will be 2.3, as it can't really be the same BR as the 57, so in that case it won't be terrible. It has a good lineup and is a tier 2 premium, so even though the vehicle itself isn't too impressive on its own, it will have a place in the game going forward. Of course though, don't take that as gospel. I don't actually know the BR or any other details at time of recording, I just assume it will be a bit lower than the 57, and as well will probably sit in tier 2. So yeah, quick mention here, we'll be getting this one soon. Nothing super exciting, but it will be worth picking up if you have the time. Next up, we have some new aircraft, which do have some application for CAS, and we're starting off with a pretty great one, a new premium edition in the air tree, the SU-6. This is a single-seat version with no tail gunner and no 37mm guns. It's equipped with two 23mm, the same ones the IL-2s use, and four 7.62 machine guns for backup. It does though retain all of the main loadouts from the tech tree SU-6s, so the bombs and full rocket loadouts. And as well, it's also 4.3, an entire BR lower than the M71F version, although it is 3,850 GE, which is fairly pricey, but it is a fantastic CAS aircraft for tier 4. It can engage planes, strafe out ground units, and do a fair bit of work with the rockets as well. It's also not entirely useless in RRB2 if you want to use it there. If you have a fairly limited budget for GE, it's a bit too pricey to prioritise it in my opinion just for CAS. The Thunderbolt is still a decent premium at the same BR for much less money. But if you're around during the sale or get a discount, this thing is really good for the BR. It works great in any situation and will help you speed up your air research too. Next up, a very recent addition at time of writing, the ITP M1. This is a new premium available for this season's Battle Pass, and for what it is, it's very good. It comes with two 20mm guns with 400 rounds total, and one 37 in the nose with full API belts and 50 rounds of ammunition, all at the BR of 3.3. It can also carry 8 of the smaller rockets too. Flight performance is a bit of a mixed bag. It's very quick, but in general lacks the maneuverability to dogfight with a competent enemy and a good fighter. So it's a little sluggish, but it does have good maneuverability at low speeds. So if you can manage that speed well, it's still a pretty good plane for this environment. Effectively, it's a bit like a slightly more sluggish but way more versatile Yak 9T at a lower BR. This is currently the free vehicle for this season's Battle Pass, and as it's a tier 3 premium, it's definitely worth picking it up if you have the time. If you're watching this a while in the future, it'll be on the market right now as a coupon. No idea what sort of price it'll be, but if it's cheap, it will be worth nabbing. It works great in ARB to help you speed up your progress there too. All in all, it's pretty good at knocking out aircraft and tanks alike. Just be careful of your speed and watch the ground, as this thing will pick up a lot of speed in a dive. Not the easiest plane to fly, but very rewarding once you get the hang of it. Next up, we have the SU-9, and to a lesser extent the premium SU-11 as well. This is a twin-engine jet that, as you can probably tell, took heavy inspiration from the Me-262. It's not primarily a CAS plane, but it does bridge the gap between 5.7 and 8.0, which Russia was really struggling with. It's not the best, but has some light potential for gun CAS and can carry bombs as well. A single 500kg or two 250s, and these 250s do drop separately, which is really good. For direct firepower, it's equipped with the Russian standard for their earlier jets, two 23mm guns and one 37. With AP, these guns can cut through a fair few tanks from the top, and with some practice, the bombs can be pretty easy to aim too, all the while being able to cut down enemy aircraft as well. It's not very maneuverable, but it is quick, and with some practice you can have a pretty decent impact in the air. In tandem with this is the premium Su-11 version, which is slightly better than the 9. The engines are more powerful and no longer positioned under the wings like the 262, so the wing area is redesigned. Effectively, it's just a slightly faster version and not really worth buying just as a CAS aircraft alone. It's pretty strong in ARB right now if you're looking to power through the air tree, so it does double up in that regard. But still, I would not buy it just for the CAS alone, it's still quite expensive. You can save a lot of money and get a version in the tree that does effectively the same job for free. And finally, we have the Su-17M2, the first sweep-wing aircraft in the game. But it still doesn't really excel as top-tier CAS. It's very large, not hugely maneuverable despite the wings, and has no countermeasures either. And despite carrying some powerful ordnance, it just doesn't get enough of it to rival the analogues the other nations have. Like the Su-7BKL, it can carry 6 S-24 rockets and a lot of bombs as well, all with the ballistic computer support, but its primary appeal are the AGMs it can carry, which are very powerful, but at max it can only carry 2 of them. Firstly, it gets 2 of the KH-23M AGMs, the same ones the AK-38s carry, which since the last video have actually had their control type changed. They're now keyboard guided like bullpups. The Su-17 can also take out 2 types of laser-guided AGMs, a pair of KH-25s or a single KH-29L. The 29L is essentially just a more powerful variant and not really worth taking, as the 25s will usually one-shot anyway and you get 2 of them. These things have 2 different types of tracking depending on your angle, and as well have a fairly impressive range. To aim them, you need to position the enemy tank in the middle of this green circle. If you're flying quite level, the missile will fly up and then back down to land on top of the tank, and if you're flying at a slightly downward angle, it will just fly straight, which in my experience is way more consistent. Although, even if you keep the tank in the circle, the missiles do sometimes still miss, which is a bit of a problem as you only get 2 maximum. The KH-23M is likely the most user-friendly missile to take out, as it controls the same as bullpups, and a lot of you likely have some experience with this aiming system already, so it's nice and familiar in that respect. In addition though, this thing can take out R60 AAMs as well as AGMs. It can carry 2 of them with the KH-23M loadout and 4 with the others, so there is a fair bit of versatility there. Ultimately, it's not as well suited to the casserole in War Thunder when compared to the more nimble and better armed alternatives like the G91s and A4Es, but it's not an expensive plane to fly out and can be used in the 10.3 lineup, which is a big plus. Despite the slightly negative presentation I've given of the Su-17, it's still a fairly versatile jet that, when spaded, does have a fair bit to offer. Next up, we have a couple of changes to existing vehicles. The first change is regarding the T-26-4, the variant with the 75mm howitzer, and thankfully it has now gained the APHE round stock and isn't just stuck with the shrapnel shell from the offset. Like I mentioned in the video, this is a really good change. It makes the vehicle way more approachable to a new player, so this is really good. Happy to see this changed. Next up, the T-3485 D5T has received a reduction in turret armor. The neck and turret face are now 54mm thick instead of 90mm, which does actually hurt this thing's survivability a fair bit. It's now frontally weak to autocannons and SPAA, and overall is much less trolley than before. I can never say that right in my accent. It's like I'm either trying to say trolley, like shopping trolley, or trolley, which sounds unbelievably pretentious. I can't win. Anyway, yeah, a bit of a nerf to this thing sadly. And maybe we'll see a BR reduction one day because of this, but it's too early to say really. Next up, the IS-1 and 2 series of heavy tanks have had their hull armor changed to variable thickness, which basically just streamlines the overall layout. It has made some parts slightly weaker and some parts slightly stronger, so overall it's a decent change, but doesn't really alter the vehicle's performance much. So next up we have the BR adjustments, and there have actually been a lot of them, and thankfully the vast majority of them have been positive in my opinion. So let's go from lowest to highest. First off, we have the Su-51. This has gone from 1.3 to 1.0. Overall, a positive alteration. I don't think this will really change anything though, as it's still going to be fighting effectively the same enemies, and it could already get through all of them easily anyway. So not a huge performance change, I'd say. It's still held back by exactly the same limitations of no armor and only having 8 rounds, so down-tiering it isn't at all going to fix those problems. So I doubt it's really going to perform much better here. Although, if you fancy playing a bit of 1.0 for whatever reason, you can add this tank to your lineup now. Next up is the SU-76M, which has been brought down to tier 1 and now sits at a BR of 2.0. Same goes for the premium version as well, although that version remains in tier 2. Again, positive change I think. The vehicle wasn't exactly easy to use, and now it is at least going to be in with a chance of fighting easier enemies. It is still very weak, but as the crew is spaced out, it will take a while for a low tier tank to knock it out with the smaller guns, so that is a plus. It also makes a 2.0 lineup possible now, which is pretty good stuff. Next up is the SU-122, which has switched places with the ZIS-30 in the tech tree, and has also been bumped down to 2.3, 2 jumps, which is really nice. I'm glad it's actually gone down to 2.3 and not just 2.7, as now it does actually have a lineup and offers an alternate playstyle option to the ZIS-30. Of course, the ZIS-30 is way better, but you can play this thing along with the T-80 and T-28E now, which are a pretty strong pair of vehicles. Of course, the lack of reliable damage and slow reload will hurt this thing no matter what the BR, but at least at 2.3 it can now fight weaker enemies consistently and have the potential to utilise the armour a little bit more. At this BR it might be worth picking up for a few games, as the HE one-shots will always be pretty fun, and hey, maybe with the alterations to HE damage going on right now, this thing will get a bit more consistent. In any case though, it still doesn't have a lot of longevity or versatility, but at least now it is in the best spot it can be. Next up is the SU-57B, which has been moved down to tier 2, and moved from 3.3 to 2.7, another fairly large jump. And still, I don't think this is what the tank really needed. On its own, it still now will of course perform better, that's a given, but at 2.7 it shares the BR only with the T50 in the tech tree, which is good, but not a lineup worth maining in any way, which means the BR reduction doesn't really change anything. In my opinion, buffing its reload to fit the other 57mm guns is the way to go with this thing. Otherwise, it really isn't going to have much of a place. If it did get this reload buff, it could easily be at a higher BR again and work in some of the later lineups too. Either that, or maybe some new vehicles will come along around this tier 1 day, who knows. But anyway, right now it's still hardly better than what the ZIS-30 has to offer. Next up, we have the YAG-10, which has been moved from 3.7 to 3.3 and transferred to rank 2, after the SU-57B, so it's now out of the SPA line and into the TD line. Again, this doesn't change too much. It isn't a vehicle worth maining, and the 3.3 lineup can only really consist of this thing, the first T-34, and the T-50, which isn't the worst lineup, but it still isn't hugely strong either. Much like the previous vehicles, not a lot changes with this BR adjustment, but it is still a positive alteration, and in any case, I don't think this thing needs to go any lower now. Next is the wobbly boy, the ZIS-43, and as it's still wobbling around, its BR reduction to 3.7 isn't hugely functional. It does mean that you can use it in the 3.7 lineup, which is very strong if you want an AA that can tackle some tanks too, but it's still far from the best anti-air. Although it does now have a stronger place in the game regardless of its fairly poor performance as a vehicle alone, so good change. Next up are the KV-2s. Both the 1939 and the 1940 have been bumped down to 3.7, and the tech tree version moves to rank 2, which is a good change. The armor has more worth, and you can add it to the 3.7 lineup now too, which is fairly strong. It would still be nice to see a slight reload buff to this thing, as its drawbacks are all still there, but now the armor can potentially do more work against some of the weaker vehicles it can now see. Again, it's a change that makes sense, but the KV-2 is still not going to be the most meta vehicle anytime soon. Next up, I need to think of an alternative to next up, I can't keep saying that, is the ZSU-37, which has been moved down to 4.3, another positive change. It wasn't the strongest anti-air at the tier by far, and still isn't going to be, but it can now be used in the 4.3 lineup and has the ability to be slightly more effective against tanks there, though still not to a reliable degree. Overall though, good change. Coming up next, there we go, is the SU-152, which has been moved down to 4.3. Again, a positive alteration. It wasn't exactly strong on its previous BR, and it still likely isn't going to be strong at 4.3 either, but it does now have the potential to maybe fight some weaker enemies and maybe bounce some more shots. But overall, this likely won't change too much, but it does give you the ability to play it at 4.3, which is nice as it is a vehicle that can work in up tiers and will take some pressure off the KV-1 ZIS-5 in that lineup. So, another good one. Next in order is actually a BR raise, the first one so far. The T-3457s, Tech Tree and Premium, have gone from 4.3 to 4.7. And I do understand the reasoning for this one. They were both very powerful tanks, and still are, I think. At 4.7, they can now see 5.7 games, which will hurt a bit, but they still have the mobility and firepower to be effective. They just probably won't be as clubby anymore. 4.7 is getting a lineup now, so they will definitely have a strong place, and I do still recommend the premium version after this BR raise as well. It's still a great tank at 4.7, and even a bit higher in the up tiers. They are still going to work well. Now we just need a new 4.3 medium to plug the gap. Next in line is the KV-85, which has gone down to 4.7, which, as I mentioned in the video covering it, is a change I very much agree with. Its hull armor was, and still is, very poor, and can't really be improved by angling, so at least now it does have the chance to fight some weaker enemies that may struggle to get through the armor, especially the turret armor. It's not even going to be close to immune at 4.7, but at least now it can potentially play a bit more like a heavy tank, which is great. This is definitely a tank to go for now, as 4.7 is a pretty strong lineup with the T-34s and the various TDs you have, and the 85 fits in great there, so a really good change. Following after is the Su-100Y, which has also gone down to 4.7, another good change. Again though, I don't think this will drastically affect performance, as its main weaknesses are all still there, and it is still very vulnerable. But now at least it has a strong lineup for support and can potentially survive a bit longer now too, potentially. Also, I didn't mention it earlier as it was a very small change, but the round the Su-100Y uses has been changed. It's no longer capped APHE and has been adjusted to a semi-armor piercing HE round. It still holds the same penetration, and this doesn't change a huge amount functionally. It seems to do more damage to me, but I haven't really had the time to play around with it to get a good idea, unfortunately. It certainly isn't any weaker though. So positivity all around for this one. On the trot is the ISU-152. I did have some splash text explaining this in the tier 4 video, as this change happened just before I uploaded it annoyingly. But yeah, this thing was down tiered to 4.7 and has been moved to tier 3 and folded behind the regular Su-152. Pretty good change for this tank, and actually has pretty great armor now for 4.7. You do need to angle a bit still and use the trick with reverse, but overall 3.7s will really struggle with this thing. So it does have a place as a heavy TD and is much more workable than the regular Su-152. So it's a fun vehicle to take out, and I'm glad it's been moved down. In succession is the KV-122, a change I'm very happy about, as it does now have a bit more of a place and isn't just relegated to an objectively worse IS-2. At 5.3, it's currently the lowest vehicle BR-wise to have a 122 in a turret, which is a great advantage. Armor is still not going to be impressive though, as it's the same as the KV-85 now at 4.7. But the power of the gun, combined with a decent mobility and situationally effective armor, really gives this thing a place now as a vehicle and as a product too. The 5.3 lineup is strong, and this thing really lets the lineup work much better in up tiers, which was something it struggled with, as the ISU-122s were good but hard to use and map dependent. I still wouldn't say this thing is the very best buy you could make, but it is now worth buying for sure, as it adds something to the lineup and the game. If it's ever on sale or you just really like the 122, maybe pick it up. Post-liminary is a quick one. The premium Hong Kong T-34, is that how you pronounce it? Please don't cancel me, has been moved to 5.7 alongside the version in the Chinese tree. So if you have it, it's gone up, which doesn't change a huge amount really. It's still a good, versatile anti-air and will still be worth picking up if it becomes earnable again. Successionally, we have the Object 268, are you getting bored of this yet? Which has been moved down to 7.0, another good change. This thing, now paired with the T-44-100 and one other new 7.0 we'll look at next, can make a pretty nice lineup now, and the armor of course will be more reliable. It still has all of the same drawbacks, but it can now potentially rely on the armor a little bit more in certain situations, which is better than nothing. Seriate is the IS-3. I know a lot of people have been waiting for this for a long time. The IS-3 is now 7.0, which is a pretty nice step for it. As I said before, it can now be used alongside the 44-100 and 268, which does add a decent amount of playstyles for the lineup. I don't necessarily think it'll be overpowered, but in the right spot it can now do very well. I don't think 7.0 games will be exceedingly common for it though, as there are only 6 researchable 6.0 tanks in the entire game that this thing can now meet. The Cent 1, Panther G, M36B1, 76 Jumbo, and the American and Japanese Bulldogs. America is the only nation that can make a lineup here. Britain kind of can with the Comet and Challenger backups, but in any case, playing in precisely 6.0 matchmaking will still be quite rare. so I don't imagine this thing will be top tier much. In any case though, it can now avoid 8.3, which is probably the most important thing here. It'll be interesting to see how this one's going to go. Consecutively is the ZSU 57-2, which has gone down to 7.3. Another good change for the tree, as now another lineup can be made as well. This thing can now avoid 8.7, which put it against a lot of tough tanks in the TD role, but now it can potentially fight some weaker enemies and slower aircraft. I don't think this will change a massive amount, but it will now be definitely stronger against tanks, and can potentially do a bit more damage frontally as well. Nice change. Sequentially is the T-54 1949, which has been removed from the folder with the other T-54s and moved down to 7.3, while the other two later and earlier variants remain at 7.7. It's a bit weird to see the BRs fluctuate in this way, but I think this was the only thing that could have been done to make the 1949 relevant in a game sense. Having 3 T-54s in a lineup wasn't hugely versatile, and the 1949 was just a slightly but still objectively worse 1951 model, just losing the heat. It was the least impressive of the 3 variants, so I'm glad it does now have a more meaningful place in the game, and can also create a lineup with the ZSU, BMP, this thing, and maybe one of the 7.0s as well. The smaller cupolas on the 1949 will now also come into play as an advantage, as it will be fighting a lot more APHE. So I think this thing will be fairly strong here, and in any case, avoiding the 8.7 stabilizer turbo rumble will help it too. In down tiers against certain tanks, I do think it's perhaps a bit too strong from the perspective I have on the vehicle, but we'll just have to see how things turn out. Ensuing, we have the Object 120, which has gone down to 7.3. Not a change I personally think was needed, as it still performs well, and now there are 2 7.3 pack premiums, but in any case it will of course perform better now, and has the chance to fight outside of stabilizers. I can understand why it went down, as it is very map dependent and very weak to everything, and also quite easy to misplay I think, but it will be a bit too strong at 7.3, seeing as it entirely negates the armor of certain tanks that only have armor to rely on. But it did sort of already do that anyway, but in any case we'll have to see how things go on that front. It's still a very functional tank if you know where to put it, even more so now, but all of its drawbacks are still there. Down-tiering it won't change its limitations on most maps, or all of the facets of its poor survivability. We'll have to see how things go on this one. Finally, and probably the most contentious alteration here, the T-80U and T-72B3 have been downtiered to 10.3 along with the T-90. On the surface I can appreciate this seems like a fairly senseless change, they are really powerful vehicles after all, but ultimately 10.3 games are still fairly rare in the grand scheme of things, and if you want the best CAS you'll still need to play at 10.7 with the K-52 and the MiG-21s. If you do actually manage to get into 10.3 games, the lineup will of course have the potential to work very well, but there are still some maps where these vehicles just won't be able to retain much control. This of course is a change with lots of potential consequences, but I don't think the effects of it will be felt as consistently as it seems on the surface. It's too early to say how things will stabilize and what will come next, so we'll just have to wait and see. I don't really think the playstyles of these vehicles will have to change at all though, just that in 10.3 games, if you're actually lucky enough to get them, you can get away with playing much more aggressively. Quickly to tack on to the end here, some of the CAS aircraft have been changed as well. We have the MiG-15 Biz now at 8.3, which means it can work in one extra lineup, which is nice, and the Su-7B and BKL have gone down one notch as well, 9.3 and 9.7. The 9.3 lineup now gets a good CAS option, and the 9.7 lineup gets one too. As 10.0 was a fairly shifty BR, the BKL didn't really have an immediate place to perform excellently, but it should hopefully be able to do that now. Good stuff. So next up, we have the final updated lineups for Russian ground forces. And this time I've made 3 sets, depending on how much money you can dedicate to the game. So first off, we have free to play, so this chart has no premiums and no extra crew slot either. Everything here you can make for free. And as always with these lineups, I'm not trying to say that these are objectively perfect and contain the best possible options across the board. It's just what I personally would run with, and by extension what I think would be the most useful for you guys too. The way I structure these here is to have balance among your options. If it's all possible, containing a vehicle that works in up tiers, one that excels in down tiers, and another that can work in either scenario, as well as an anti-air and a plane. But of course, you might be a player that prefers aircraft to tanks, in which case you can maybe swap out the anti-air in the lower tiers, or maybe even a normal tank for a second plane if that suits you better. All in all though, if you're struggling to find a lineup that works for Russia, hopefully these can form a bit of a baseline for you to play around with. Links to these charts as pictures will be in the description as well if you'd like to save them for later. Next we have the lineups I'd go with if you have a bit more of a moderate budget, say around £100 or so. Progression in the later tiers is the most monotonous, so I would recommend saving up and getting the 55 AM for this. And for the lower tiers, picking up a couple of useful premiums there as well. The SU6 is great for progressing through the air tree and for CAS, and the 3457 Mod 1943 is still one of the best premiums relative to its value. And also maybe pick up something like the SU85A if it's still cheap. Could be a decent tank to try out. For the later tiers, say around 5.3 to 7.7, I'd recommend getting a talisman for a few tanks and not a full-on premium. Tier 4 premiums like the IS-6, T-44-122, T-34-100, etc. are good, but they don't have much value anymore. Considering how few vehicles there are in Tier 5, and just how many there are in Tier 6, you can pick up a handful of great talismans in this rank for vehicles that work for you. And this is really what I'd aim to do. On screen is a collection of vehicles I would personally recommend putting talismans on if you like them. They're either very versatile, so they can work on multiple different maps and in up tiers, or they excel so much at their own BR that it's still worth getting a talisman on them. And again, I'd like to reiterate here, you won't have the best experience the game has to offer by buying directly into top tier from the offset. You won't have a lineup or the twitch reflexes to play around stabilizers as effectively as you need to. I'll always recommend starting from the bottom and working your way up. And when you're ready, that's when I'd get the Tier 6 Premium. You learn a lot in the lower tiers, and it's generally a much better environment to get comfortable with the game. The gameplay itself is a lot slower and more forgiving, you get new vehicles quicker, which makes your brain happy, and you can spend more time gathering map knowledge in all kinds of vehicles that play to different strengths. So the lower tier premiums definitely have tangible value here, in giving you a better experience with the game, even though in blunt honesty, buying a single Tier 6 premium is the most effective use of your money. But that money spent won't necessarily directly translate to fun, which is the aim here, right? So this is ultimately what I go for if you have a little bit of money to chuck in. And finally, we have the almost unlimited budget. If you, for whatever reason, have an almost unlimited amount of money, your mum owns a country or the Queen is your dad, these are the vehicles you should aim to pick up premium-wise. There are more premiums you could use in these lineups, but even though this one is focusing on an almost unlimited budget, there's still no need to be excessive if a premium isn't really going to add anything to the experience. For example, the IS-2 Revenge is a functionally identical premium to the tech tree version, which you can just talisman for around a third of the price, so there's no need hoovering up everything in any case. This one isn't really as important as the previous two, as I don't really think anyone is in the position to go for all of these vehicles, but I thought I might as well include it anyway. And again, for all of these, play around with them to suit you best. If you don't like slow tanks, take out some of the heavies and add in a light tank or another plane. Just use these as a foundation if you need one. So there we are guys, that's basically everything we need to cover. It's been a long ride through this series, and bloody hell, my life has changed hugely during its run. Certainly a time I will never forget. But hey, we still have lots of tech trees to cover, and next we'll be going through the USA. So I hope to see you all there. Anyway, to celebrate the series, I've gone back to get a kill with every single Russian tank. Thank you for sticking with me and watching this probably quite boring video. Anyway, I really hope you enjoy. Thank you very, very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.